There's something Carl Jung understood about human nature that most people never dare to consider. He said that personality isn't what we show the world, but what we desperately try to hide from ourselves. Every trait you carry, whether it's shyness that grips your throat in social situations, that aggressive edge that emerges when you're cornered, the relentless drive to produce and achieve, or the paralyzing indecision that haunts your quiet moments, each one is merely the visible tip of a psychological iceberg floating in the depths of your unconscious mind. These traits don't just reveal your conscious patterns of behavior. They expose your hidden wounds, the traumas that whisper in silence, the desires you've buried so deep you've forgotten they exist. Jung believed that true personality emerges from the tension between who you think you are and who you've refused to become. It's in this space, this uncomfortable territory between your ego and your shadow, that your deepest secrets reveal themselves. What if I told you that the person you believe yourself to be might be nothing more than a collection of survival strategies dressed up as personality traits? What if your most defining characteristics are actually your psyche's way of protecting you from pain you've never fully acknowledged? This isn't about changing who you are. It's about discovering who you've always been beneath the layers of adaptive behavior that you've mistaken for your identity. Take a moment to consider someone you know who describes themselves as naturally anxious or just a control freak. What if these weren't innate qualities at all, but rather chronic responses to emotional wounds that never properly healed? There's a profound difference between authentic personality traits and trauma responses that have crystallized into behavioral patterns over time. Perfectionism, for instance, rarely emerges from a genuine love of excellence. More often, it's the armor worn by someone who learned early that love was conditional on flawless performance. Perhaps they grew up in a household where praise only came with perfect grades, where mistakes were met with disappointment so sharp it felt like abandonment. The child's nervous system, brilliant in its survival instincts, developed perfectionism as a shield against the unbearable possibility of being unloved. The compulsive people pleaser isn't naturally generous. They're usually someone whose childhood taught them that their own needs were too much, too selfish, too dangerous to express. So they learn to anticipate everyone else's needs, to make themselves indispensable through service, to earn their place in the world by becoming what others required them to be. Their nervous system learned that conflict meant rejection, and rejection meant annihilation. When a personality trait feels rigid, when it shows up, even in situations where it serves no purpose, when it persists despite causing pain, there's usually an emotional secret hidden beneath it. These aren't character flaws to be fixed. They're intelligent adaptations to environments that couldn't hold your full humanity. The question isn't whether you have these traits, but whether you're ready to understand what they're trying to tell you about the love you needed but didn't receive. You believe you know yourself. You've constructed a story about who you are, built from years of experiences, feedback, and internal observations. But what if this story is based on a distorted reflection, like looking at yourself in a funhouse mirror that warps your image? Beyond recognition, this is what I call the emotional mirror effect. And it's one of the most profound ways our self-perception gets hijacked. Your brain didn't develop its sense of self in isolation. It formed its understanding of who you are through the emotional responses of the people around you, particularly in your earliest years. If you were raised by someone who was chronically anxious, their nervous system taught your nervous system that the world was dangerous. If you were parented by someone who was emotionally unavailable, their disconnection became the template for how you learned to relate to your own inner world. The narcissistic parent who criticized your sensitivity taught you that your emotional nature was a flaw to be hidden. The anxious mother who couldn't tolerate your independence taught you that your autonomy was a threat to love. The depressed father who couldn't celebrate your achievements taught you that your successes were either meaningless or somehow burdensome to others. These weren't conscious lessons. They were emotional downloads that happened at the level of your nervous system, shaping your identity before you had the cognitive capacity to question them. Your brain, in its incredible adaptability, molded your personality around these early emotional experiences, not because they were true, but because they were repeated. The most frequently activated neural pathways became the superhighways of your personality, while other possibilities remained as barely traveled back roads. You didn't become who you are because of some essential truth about your nature. You became who you are because of the emotional environment that surrounded your developing nervous system. This is why so many people feel like strangers to themselves. They're not living from their authentic core, but from an identity that was shaped by someone else's emotional instability. The shy person might actually be naturally expressive, but learn to hide their light to avoid overwhelming a parent who couldn't handle their brilliance. The angry person might actually be deeply sensitive, but learn that rage was the only emotion that created boundaries in a chaotic household. There's a particular kind of self-deception that masquerades as self-awareness, and it's one of the most common traps in personal development. People say, "I'm just this way," or "this is who I am," when what they're really describing is a survival strategy that's been running on autopilot for so long they've forgotten it's a choice. Your impulsive behavior might not be a character flaw. It might be your psyche's way of moving through life so quickly that you can't be abandoned, because abandonment requires someone to be still long enough to be left behind. Your emotional coldness might not be natural detachment. It might be a sophisticated defense system that prevents you from feeling the depth of pain that intimacy might bring. Your chronic busyness might not be productivity. It might be a way of avoiding the silence where your unprocessed emotions are waiting to be felt. These strategies were brilliant when you developed them. They served you in environments where your authentic self wasn't safe, where your real needs couldn't be met, where your true nature was too much for the people around you to handle. But strategies that once protected you can become prisons that limit you. The armor that once kept you safe can become the very thing that keeps love out. When you don't question a trait, when you accept it as an unchangeable part of your identity, it becomes fossilized. It stops being a choice and becomes a compulsion. But when you can observe it with consciousness, when you can see it as one possible response among many, it transforms from a limitation into a bridge toward greater freedom. The difference between authentic personality and adaptive strategy is flexibility. Authentic traits serve you in some situations and naturally recede in others. Adaptive strategies show up everywhere, regardless of context, because they're not responding to present circumstances, but to past wounds. True self-knowledge isn't about accepting everything about yourself as fixed. It's about recognizing which parts of you are authentic expressions and which parts are protective mechanisms that might be ready to evolve. The human brain is far more malleable than most people realize. Neuroscience has revealed something that mystics and philosophers have long suspected. You literally become who you repeatedly pretend to be. Your personality traits aren't fixed characteristics encoded in your DNA. They're neural networks that have been strengthened through repetition, like pathways in a forest that become more defined the more they're traveled. Every time you respond to stress with anxiety, you're strengthening the neural pathway that connects perceived threat to anxious response. Every time you react to conflict with withdrawal, you're reinforcing the neural network that equates confrontation with danger. Every time you meet your own needs with self-criticism, you're building the neural superhighway that makes self-compassion feel foreign and self-attack feel familiar. But here's where it gets fascinating. The same neuroplasticity that allowed these patterns to form also allows them to be rewired. Your brain doesn't distinguish between real personality and practiced personality. It simply strengthens whatever gets repeated. This means the traits you've carried for decades can be modified, not through positive thinking or willpower, but through conscious, repeated practice of new neural pathways. The key is understanding that changing ingrained patterns requires more than insight. It requires what neuroscientists call experience-dependent plasticity. Your brain needs to have new experiences, repeated consistently over time, to build alternative neural networks. This is why people can have profound realizations about their patterns and still find themselves trapped in the same behaviors. Understanding without embodied practice is like having a map without walking the territory. When you consciously choose a different response to a familiar trigger, you're not just changing your behavior in that moment. You're building new neural infrastructure that makes different choices more available in the future. The anxious person, who practices staying present with their fear, rather than immediately escaping into worry, is literally rewiring their brain's response to uncertainty. The people pleaser who practices saying no with compassion is building neural pathways that make boundary setting feel more natural over time. This isn't about becoming someone else. It's about becoming who you might have been if you're nervous. System had developed in an environment of safety and attunement. It's about giving your brain the experiences it needs to remember that you have choices beyond the survival strategies that have been running your life. There's a powerful way to begin recognizing the different aspects of your personality that goes beyond traditional self-reflection. Instead of trying to analyze yourself as one unified being, consider that you might be more like a cast of characters, each with their own motivations, fears, and strategies for navigating the world. Think about your most prominent personality traits and imagine that each one is a distinct character living inside you. There's the critic, who points out every flaw and potential failure before anyone else can. There's the pleaser, who smiles and agrees even when your stomach churns with resentment. There's the controller, who tries to manage every variable to prevent disappointment. There's the escapist, who finds ways to avoid difficult emotions through distraction, substance, or fantasy. These aren't pathological aspects of yourself. They're parts of your psyche that develop to serve specific functions. The critic tries to protect you from shame by finding the flaws first. The pleaser attempts to ensure love by making you indispensable. The controller works to prevent the chaos that once felt overwhelming. The escapist offers relief from pain that feels too intense to bear. Once you can see these as characters rather than as your core identity, something profound shifts. You begin to realize that you're not the critic or the pleaser or the controller. You're the awareness that can observe all of these parts, the consciousness that can witness their strategies without being consumed by them. This is what psychologists call the self with a capital S, the unchanging witness that exists beyond your various adaptive strategies. Try having conversations with these different parts of yourself. Ask the critic what they're afraid will happen if they stop pointing out flaws. Ask the pleaser what they need to feel safe enough to express their authentic opinions. Ask the controller what they're trying to protect you from. Ask the escapist what pain they're helping you avoid. When you listen to these parts with curiosity rather than judgment, they often reveal the wounds they're trying to heal and the love they're trying to secure. This practice doesn't make these parts disappear. Instead, it helps them evolve from unconscious reactions into conscious choices. When you can see the critic as a part of you rather than as the truth about who you are, you can appreciate their protective intention while choosing whether to follow their guidance. When you recognize the pleaser as a strategy rather than your nature, you can honor their desire for connection while finding more authentic ways to create intimacy. There's a particular kind of self-deception that's so subtle, so seemingly rational, that most people never recognize it's happening. It's the addiction to internal consistency, The compulsive need to make your current identity make sense, even when that identity is limiting your growth and happiness. Your brain is wired to maintain coherence in your self-concept. It's deeply uncomfortable with contradictions, with evidence that challenges your established sense of who you are. So, even when a personality trait consistently creates problems in your life, even when it sabotages your relationships or limits your potential, your mind will work overtime to justify it rather than question it. The stubborn person convinces themselves that their inflexibility is actually integrity. The people pleaser tells themselves that their self-abandonment is really generosity. The perfectionist believes their impossible standards are just having high expectations. The emotionally distant person frames their unavailability as independence. These aren't conscious lies. They're the stories your brain tells to maintain the coherence of your identity. This is why insight alone rarely creates lasting change. Understanding that you have a pattern isn't enough if you're still committed to being right about who you are. Your brain will use the insight to further justify the pattern rather than to question it. The perfectionist will say, "Yes, I'm demanding, but that's because I care about quality." The people pleaser will say, "Yes, I ignore my needs, but that's because I'm compassionate." The criticism becomes evidence of virtue rather than invitation to growth. True transformation requires what psychologists call positive disintegration. It requires being willing to let your current identity come apart so that a more authentic self can emerge. This means tolerating the discomfort of not knowing who you are, the anxiety of being inconsistent, the fear of being wrong about fundamental assumptions you've held about yourself. Most people avoid this discomfort by staying stuck in familiar patterns, even when those patterns cause suffering. They choose the pain of limitation over the uncertainty of growth. They prefer the prison of a known identity to the freedom of an unknown possibility. But the people who are willing to let themselves be wrong about who they are, who can tolerate the temporary chaos of identity dissolution, are the ones who discover who they might become. Gabor has spent decades working with people whose behaviors seem self-destructive, addictive, or socially challenging. What he's discovered is that most of what we call character flaws are actually intelligent adaptations to environments that couldn't hold our full humanity. Before judging any behavior, Mate asks a crucial question. Why is this trying to heal? Your addiction to people-pleasing isn't a weakness. It's likely the strategy of someone who learned early that their authentic needs were too much, too selfish, too dangerous to express. In a family system where conflict meant chaos, where disappointment meant withdrawal of love, becoming hyper-attuned to others' needs was a brilliant survival strategy. Your nervous system learned that your emotional safety depended on making others comfortable, even at the cost of your own authenticity. Your chronic anger isn't a character flaw. It might be the only emotion that was allowed in your family, the only feeling that created boundaries when everything else was ignored or minimized. Perhaps you learned that sadness was met with dismissal, that fear was labeled as weakness, that joy was too much for the adults around you to handle. Anger might have been the only emotion that made people pay attention, the only feeling that created the space you needed to exist. Your tendency to withdraw and isolate isn't antisocial behavior. It might be the wisdom of someone who learned that intimacy meant invasion, that closeness meant losing yourself, that other people's emotions were too overwhelming for your sensitive nervous system to handle. Withdrawal might have been the only way to maintain your sense of self in relationships that felt engulfing or demanding. Even your most self-destructive patterns make sense when viewed through the lens of what they're trying to accomplish. The workaholic isn't just ambitious. They might be trying to earn the love that was only available when they were achieving. The perfectionist isn't just detail-oriented. They might be trying to avoid the shame that came with making mistakes. The people pleaser isn't just kind. They might be trying to prevent the abandonment that felt like death when they were small. This understanding doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it does provide a foundation for compassion. When you can see your most challenging traits as strategies that once served you, you can begin to appreciate their intelligence while exploring whether they still serve your current life. You can thank them for the ways they protected you while gently examining whether they're still necessary. The question isn't whether you should change these patterns. The question is whether you're ready to understand what they're trying to heal, so you can find more conscious ways to meet those legitimate needs. Your most irritating traits are often your psyche's way of trying to restore safety, connection, or control in a world that once felt dangerous, lonely, or chaotic. Gabor reminds us that before we judge any behavior, we must ask ourselves, what is this trying to heal? Your personality traits aren't random characteristics that define your worth. They're the language your soul uses to communicate unmet needs, unhealed wounds, and unlived possibilities. They're your psyche's attempt to restore safety, connection, and authenticity in a world that may have taught you these things were dangerous. When you can listen to these patterns with presence rather than criticism, when you can hear them as messages rather than condemn them as failures, something profound shifts. You begin to move from unconscious repetition toward conscious creation. You start to see that you're not trapped by your personality. You're simply speaking in the emotional language you learned when you were too young to know there were other ways to communicate. The perfectionist's relentless standards might be trying to heal the wound of conditional love. The people-pleaser's self-abandonment might be trying to repair the breaking connection they experienced when their needs were too much. The angry person's rage might be trying to restore the boundaries that were violated when they were powerless. The withdrawn person's isolation might be trying to protect the sensitivity that was once overwhelmed. True self-knowledge isn't about discovering who you are as if you were a fixed entity waiting to be uncovered. It's about recognizing who you've been conditioned to be so you can consciously choose who you're becoming. It's about understanding that your most challenging traits are often your greatest teachers, pointing you toward the healing you need and the growth you're ready for. Your personality is not your prison. It's your starting point. Every trait you carry, every pattern you repeat, every strategy you use to navigate the world contains information about both your wounds and your potential. When you can see your traits as adaptive intelligence rather than fixed limitations, you create space for them to evolve. The shy person might discover they're not naturally timid, but naturally discerning. Someone who chooses their words carefully because they understand the power of expression. The angry person might find they're not naturally aggressive, but naturally passionate. Someone whose intensity is meant to create change rather than destruction. The people pleaser might realize they're not naturally selfless, but naturally empathetic. Someone whose gift for attunement can serve authentic connection rather than self-abandonment. Your most persistent patterns are often your soul's way of trying to complete something that was interrupted in your early development. They're attempts to finish conversations that were never allowed to happen, to express needs that were never met, to receive the love that was never offered. When you can hear this underlying message, you can begin to give yourself what you've been unconsciously trying to get from others. If this exploration has stirred something in you, if it's helped you see your own patterns through a lens of compassion rather than judgment, try this practice. Take a moment to identify the personality trait that frustrates you most about yourself. Instead of trying to change it or judge it, ask it this question: what are you trying to heal in me? What did you need when you first learned to show up? This way, listen to whatever emerges without trying to fix or change it. Sometimes, the most profound healing happens not through transformation, but through understanding. Share your discoveries in the comments below. Your willingness to explore these patterns with honesty and compassion might be exactly what someone else needs to begin their own journey of self-discovery. Remember, you're not broken. You're just speaking in an emotional language you learned before you knew there were other ways to communicate. The conversation between who you've been and who you're becoming is one of the most sacred dialogues you'll ever have.